Hi, my name is Paul Arnold and I'm a qualified psychotherapist and trained coach. And today I want to talk about dealing with your own addictions. Now, the very first thing I should say is I'm more like a GP psychotherapist. I don't have specialism in addictions. So in that sense, I'm sharing you some general principles, but obviously, this is something that potentially when you do go into therapy, you really want to work with someone who specializes in addictions. So let's start a bit. Well, what's going on with addictions? Look, what we know is that very often we're using our addictions as a way to sort of dissociate away from the stresses, the emotions, the trauma, the pain in our lives that seem intolerable. And what we do is we then sort of, get that dopamine hit that basically sort of takes us away, from all that pain that we are suffering. And we know there are many ways that we numb out those feelings, be it the classic ones of sort of smoking, eating, drinking, drug taking, sexing, gambling, shopping, even exercise. So what do the stats say? Well, looking up at some figures, alcohol, I was surprised. It's only about 1.4% of the adult population have got a drinking disorder. Now, I think there probably is a lot of hidden drinking in there. But the very worrying fact is only 18% of people who are addicted are seeking treatment. That's a heck of a lot of people who are out there. And then in terms of drug taking, cannabis is the most common one, about 2%, and other drugs, cocaine, ketamine, heroin, etc., is only 0.8% of the population. Gambling, 2.4% have got a problem with gambling. So whilst these figures may seem small, the reality is the impact they have on other people is immense. And I'm going to do a different video about that. My guesstimate is one person's addiction impacts significantly 10 other people. You think about it, your partner, maybe you've got a couple of kids, your mum and dad, then you got your friends, etc., your work colleagues. So at this point, it's them who really feel it as much as you feel it yourself. So, what causes it? Sure, there is a genetic predisposition in some people, and, we've often seen people who jump out of one addiction into another addiction. So we've got to be aware of that. And all we're doing is we're moving from the frying pan into the fire. And obviously there are certain, things that are very addictive. This big dopamine hit. And actually what we know is that the most addictive is heroin. I had one client I was dealing with who it took him just 2 fixes of sort of heroin before he was addicted for, I think it was 30 years. Now, other things that follow on from that are nicotine, cocaine, alcohol and caffeine. And I've got to put my hand up, I am addicted to caffeine. But I think there are some addictions that maybe are more tolerable than others. And also it's very often not just the biological stuff, it's what's happened to us. And we know all the work on trauma and that fantastic book by Bessel van der Kolk, The Body Keeps the Score, about the very close correlation between people who have had PTSD and their addictions to lots of different ways of trying to numb away the trauma which they suffered from. And one of the other things is that we know is that as children, our significant caregivers give us what's called affect attunement. That basically means, emotional stabilizing. And sometimes if we hadn't had what's called a good enough mother, we don't have what's called good affect regulation. And if we don't have good affect regulation, it means it doesn't take as much to tip over the edge. And so we will rely upon other things to soothe and calm us down. you know. And then we also have, cultural norms. You think about it, your great grandfather, no doubt smoked because that was the cultural norm at the time. Certain, businesses, I know, cocaine was just, a common thing. And if you didn't do it, you weren't quite in the in crowd. And so therefore there is incredible pressure. And for some people, once they first start, they may carry on longer than other people do. So what's going on neurologically? Neurologically, we know that it's a lot to do with the dopamine hits that we get from that, and also another thing which is called glutamate. And what basically happens is that this takes us to a high, this level that we don't normally expect, and obviously curbs all those horrible feelings we had. But then, of course, we then have the crash. It's like the sugar crash that you have. And obviously, we then know that what basically happens is we get desensitized, and, we can often find within the brain stops producing as much dopamine as it should do normally because it recognizes there's enough there. So we therefore get a double low. So what can you do to manage it? Look, the very, very first step, to go back to the 18%, is you've got to admit it. You've got to stand up and own what's going on, And obviously, I therefore think it really is a most important stage to seek help. I really do not believe that willpower alone will last you in the long term. You do need to get this professionally looked into, And I think that, we've got to look at what's the underlying reasons. Very often something happened that if we don't deal with the underlying reason, all we're doing is we're just delaying it, and we'll put another addiction within our place after that. And then we then got to look at other things about, can we look at, what are the triggers that goes on? Who are the people who trigger us? What are the environments that trigger us? What's the situations? And then we then got to then look at also, what are alternative strategies? I was hearing of a wonderful organisation that was talking about running out the addiction. So in other words, rather than going to one's addiction, one goes for a run instead. And then one of the other things we need to do is actually help to learn to manage our emotions better, to go and do all that stuff. Now, I hear that lots of people say, well, all these 12-step programs, very religious, and I get that. I'm not religious myself. But actually, I think the critical thing that sits behind the 12-step program is community. It's the fact of a lot of you are coming together in the same space that makes it feel less difficult to do. And you then have support there. And I really do encourage you to get support. Support from the family, support from other people, and obviously, as you guess, I would say this, support from therapy. Anyway, I hope that has helped, and good luck with your journey.